Daniel lived a simple life. He worked in a small workshop at the edge of town, fixing tools and building furniture for people who needed them. He was quiet, never the type to stand in the middle of a crowd or to raise his voice louder than others. Most people in the town respected him for his kindness, but few thought there was anything extraordinary about him. To them, he was just Daniel, the man who worked with wood, the one who helped neighbors when their fences broke or when a door got stuck. The day of the town festival was bright and lively. Colorful banners hung across the square, and children ran around with sweet cakes in their hands. Musicians played cheerful songs while people gathered in groups, laughing and enjoying the warm evening. Every year the festival brought joy, but this year it also brought something unusual: travelers from far away. Among them was a tall woman named Celira. She looked different from everyone in the town. She carried herself with confidence, her back straight, her eyes sharp like she was always ready for a challenge. At her side was a long wooden blade, polished smooth, which she carried almost like a part of her body. She wasn't dressed like a simple traveler either. Her clothes were strong and fitted, made for movement, not decoration. People noticed her quickly. Whispers followed her as she walked through the square. She did not act shy about the attention. In fact, she seemed to welcome it. Soon she called out to the crowd, asking if any man was brave enough to face her in a sparring match. At first, a few young men stepped forward, laughing and eager to impress the onlookers. She handed them wooden blades, lighter than real ones but still strong enough to sting when they hit. One by one she fought them, and one by one she defeated them. Her strikes were fast and precise. The young men barely had a chance to raise their weapons before hers knocked them down or out of balance. Each time she won, she smiled proudly and asked who was next. The crowd cheered at the show, though some began to feel uneasy about the way she mocked her opponents after each victory. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, quietly watching. He wasn't interested in fighting or in showing off, but something about the woman's attitude caught his attention. She did not fight to share her skill. She fought to prove she was above everyone else. The laughter in her voice each time she won was not joyful. It was sharp and heavy with pride. After several fights, Celira looked around, clearly wanting more. Her eyes landed on Daniel, who stood calm, his arms folded, not clapping or cheering like the others. She smiled when she noticed him, as if she had found something interesting at last. "You there," she called, pointing at him. "You stand so still. Do you think you are better than the others? Or are you afraid to try?" The crowd turned to look at Daniel. He shook his head lightly. "I'm only watching," he said in a steady voice. But his refusal did not satisfy Celira. She walked closer, the wooden blade resting against her shoulder. "No, you will not just stand there. You will fight me. Let us see what you can do." The crowd began to murmur. Some encouraged Daniel to accept, shouting his name and clapping. Others laughed, saying he was no match for the warrior woman. Daniel tried to refuse again, but the pressure grew. People stepped aside, making space in the square, waiting for the duel they now expected. Celira stood ready, handing him one of the spare wooden blades she carried. "Take it," she said firmly. Daniel looked at the weapon but did not move his hand. "I don't need it," he answered softly. A ripple of surprise ran through the crowd. People exchanged confused looks. Some laughed louder, thinking he was only pretending to be brave. Celira raised an eyebrow. "You mean to face me without a weapon? You're just a man, not made of steel. Do you think your hands are stronger than a blade?" Daniel gave no reply. He only stepped forward, calm as ever, and faced her in the circle that had formed. The musicians had stopped playing. The children had stopped running, and even the air seemed to still. All eyes were fixed on the two standing in the center. Celira smirked, confident in her skill. She had beaten every man before him, and now she would prove once more that no one could stand against her. Daniel, however, stood with relaxed shoulders, his hands empty but steady, as if he had no doubt about what he was doing. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the first move. Some whispered that he was foolish. Others whispered that perhaps he knew something they didn't. And so, The moment began. The wooden blade gleamed faintly in the fading sunlight as Celira raised it. Daniel stood unarmed, but his eyes were sharp, focused, not on her weapon but on her movement. The festival had turned into a stage for something none of them could have expected. What would happen next was beyond anyone's imagination. The square grew quiet. Even the laughter and music from the nearby stalls faded as people leaned forward waiting for the clash. Celira stood tall, gripping her wooden blade with confidence. Her eyes locked on Daniel, who still stood with empty hands. His calmness unsettled some of the onlookers because it was not the calmness of someone who had given up. It was the calmness of someone who seemed certain of what he was doing. Celira was the first to move. She stepped quickly, her blade slicing through the air with speed and precision. The wooden weapon whistled as it came toward Daniel's side. Gasps rose from the crowd, but Daniel shifted smoothly, just enough to let the blade pass harmlessly by. His movement was not flashy or hurried. It was almost lazy, as though he had seen the strike before it happened. Celira frowned. Her pride stung. She swung again, this time faster, aiming for his shoulder. Once more, Daniel moved only a little, his body leaning back so the blade cut through nothing but empty air. The crowd began to whisper. Some clapped nervously, others laughed in disbelief. "Fight properly," Celira barked. "Do not just dance away." Daniel said nothing. He kept his eyes steady, watching her, as though each of her strikes was part of a pattern he already knew. Anger flickered across Celira's face. She lunged forward, swinging from the left, then the right, then down from above. Her strikes were faster, harder, and each one came with the strength of someone trained for battle. Yet Daniel was always a step ahead. His feet moved lightly across the ground. He bent, turned, and shifted, letting the blade pass inches away, without once touching him. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Some shook their heads in disbelief. "Who is he?" one man murmured. "He hasn't even raised his hands." Celira gritted her teeth. Her pride burned hotter with each miss. She had come to the town to prove herself, to show she was stronger than any man she met. Yet here stood Daniel, not even trying to strike back, and still, she could not touch him. Finally, she shouted and brought the blade down in a heavy overhead swing. The strike was meant to finish it. People gasped, some even turning their heads away, thinking Daniel would surely be struck. But as the blade came down, Daniel's hand rose. In one smooth motion, he caught the wooden blade between his palm and fingers. The sound of wood meeting flesh echoed through the square. Gasps erupted everywhere. For a moment, everything froze. Celira stared down in shock. Her blade was stopped, completely stopped by nothing more than his hand. She tried to pull it back, but it didn't move. It was as though his grip had turned to iron. The crowd went silent. Children's eyes widened, and even the older men who thought they had seen everything in their lives stood stunned. No one had ever seen a man stop a weapon like that with his bare hand. Daniel's eyes never left Celira's. His face was calm, without anger, without pride, only steady control. Slowly, his fingers tightened. A faint crack filled the air. People leaned forward, hardly breathing, and then with a sudden snap, the blade broke clean in half. The sharp sound echoed across the square. Half the blade fell to the ground, rolling across the dirt. Celira stood frozen, holding only the broken hilt in her hand. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The crowd erupted into chaos, cheers, shouts, disbelief. Some clapped wildly, others shouted Daniel's name, and some simply stood with their hands over their mouths, unable to believe what they had just seen. Daniel, however, did not cheer. He did not smile or lift his arms. He simply opened his hand and let the other half of the blade fall to the ground. His fingers, though reddened by the force, were steady and unshaken. Celira stared at him, her eyes wide. "Impossible," she whispered. Her words were lost in the roar of the crowd, but Daniel heard them. He stepped back, his movements as calm as they had been since the beginning. "Enough," he said softly, though his voice carried across the square. There is no need to continue. Salira lowered her gaze to the broken blade in her hand. For the first time, doubt flickered in her sharp eyes. She had mocked him, laughed at him, called him nothing more than just a man. Yet here he was, unarmed, standing untouched, while her weapon lay broken at his feet. The people surged forward, surrounding Daniel. Questions poured at him. How did you do that? Are you trained in some art? Are your hands made of stone? Daniel shook his head and gently pushed through the crowd. It's nothing, he replied. Go back to your celebration. Enjoy the festival. But his words did not silence the whispers. To the crowd, it was not nothing. They had seen something they would never forget. Salira, still standing in the circle, did not move for a long time. Her pride was wounded deeper than any cut could reach. She had traveled far, defeated many, and believed no man could match her skill. Yet in a single moment, Daniel had shown her otherwise. As the noise of the crowd rose again, she finally lowered the broken piece of the blade and stepped out of the circle. Her thoughts burned with questions, but her voice had none. She would not forget what happened, and she knew she could not leave the town without understanding who Daniel truly was. That night, while the festival continued, laughter and music returning to the air, Salira sat alone near the fire, staring at the broken weapon in her lap. The echo of his calm voice replayed in her mind. The memory of the blade snapping in his hand haunted her. For Daniel, the duel was over. For Salira, it had only just begun. After the blade snapped in Daniel's hand, the town square was filled with noise. People shouted, cheered, and spoke to one another with wide eyes, as though they had all witnessed a legend being born before them. But Daniel himself did not stay. He quietly stepped out of the circle, ignoring the calls of the crowd, and walked away toward the far side of the square. His steps were calm, unhurried, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The crowd, however, could not let it go so easily. Men and women followed after him, asking questions in quick voices. How did you do that? Are you hiding some secret training? Were you a soldier? Daniel gave no answer beyond a soft shake of his head. His words were simple. It's nothing worth talking about. But to the people who had seen it with their own eyes, it was not nothing. Behind him, Salira still stood frozen in the circle. The broken halves of her blade lay on the ground at her feet. Her fingers clenched the hilt so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The mocking pride she had carried all day was gone, replaced by something she had never felt before: confusion. She had fought countless opponents on her travels. She had beaten men twice her size, warriors with years of training. Yet here was a man with no weapon, no flashy movements, no anger, who had stopped her strike and broken her blade as if it were nothing more than dry wood. The noise of the festival slowly returned. Music started again. Children ran through the square, and food vendors shouted about their roasted nuts and sweet bread. But Salira heard none of it. Her thoughts replayed the moment again and again. The way his hand closed around her weapon, the sharp crack, the calm look in his eyes. She knelt and picked up the broken half of the blade. For the first time in many years, her heart felt heavy. She had mocked him with the words, "You're just a man." Now those same words rang back in her mind like an echo she could not escape. As night fell, the festival lights glowed across the streets. Daniel returned to his workshop, lighting a small lamp and sitting at his table, as if nothing important had happened. He sanded a piece of wood slowly, shaping it into a chair leg. The calm rhythm of his work comforted him. He had no desire to be a hero, no interest in being the subject of town gossip. All he wanted was peace. But outside his door, people still whispered. Neighbors leaned close to one another, retelling what they had seen. Some said Daniel must have trained in secret. Others claimed he had strength not found in ordinary men. A few even said he carried the spirit of someone far greater. Each story grew bigger as it passed from mouth to mouth, and soon the entire town buzzed with wonder. Salira did not leave the square. She sat near a small fire, the broken weapon across her lap, staring into the flames. Travelers who had come with her tried to speak to her, but she waved them off. She could not understand what had happened. Pride had always been her shield. She had carried herself above others, laughing at their weakness, showing her skill without fear. But now her pride felt like a stone pressing on her chest. Finally, unable to hold her silence any longer, she rose and walked through the narrow streets toward Daniel's workshop. The lamplight inside flickered through the wooden cracks of the shutters. She stood outside for a long time, her hand raised to knock but her pride holding her back. After a while, she turned away, unable to bring herself to face him yet. She told herself she would wait until morning. The next day, the town was still buzzing with the story. People gathered in groups, retelling it with new details, each version more dramatic than the last. Daniel avoided the crowds, keeping to his workshop, while Scifi kept her distance, though her eyes often wandered in his direction. By the afternoon, she finally worked up the courage to approach him. She walked into his workshop, uninvited. Daniel looked up from his work, his hands busy smoothing a piece of timber. He did not seem surprised to see her. "You," she said, her voice firm though her eyes showed doubt. "I want to know how you did it." Daniel set the timber down gently. He wiped the dust from his hands and looked at her calmly. "There is nothing to tell," he answered. "That's a lie," Scifi said sharply. "No man can do what you did. I have fought trained warriors and none of them could have stopped me like that. And you didn't even fight. You only watched. You made me look like a fool." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I didn't want to make you a fool. I wanted you to see that strength isn't always what you think it is." His words struck her harder than any strike she had ever received in battle. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. She was used to mocking, to being mocked, to boasting, and to hearing others boast in return. But Daniel's calm voice carried no boast. He spoke as if he were telling her a simple truth. "I don't believe you," she said finally, though her voice lacked the force it had before. "Then believe what you saw." Daniel replied gently. "The blade broke because you swung with anger. Anger makes you blind. You wanted to prove something, but strength does not need to prove itself. It simply is." Scifi clenched her fists. His words cut through her pride more than his hand had cut through her blade. She turned quickly and left the workshop, but his calm expression followed her in her thoughts. That evening, when the sun dipped low and the festival lights lit the streets once more, Scifi stood apart from the crowd. The broken blade was still with her. She held it tightly, staring at it as though it might give her answers. But the only answer she could see was Daniel's steady gaze, his quiet movements, and the ease with which he had done what no one else could. For Daniel, the matter was finished. But for Scifi, the silence after the break was louder than any cheer from the crowd. It filled her ears, followed her steps, and whispered to her in the night. She could not ignore it. She would not ignore it. One way or another, she would uncover who Daniel truly was. The morning after the duel, the town was quieter than usual. People whispered about the events of the previous evening, retelling them in hushed voices. Children peeked into Daniel's workshop, hoping for a glimpse of the man who had done something no one could understand. Travelers and locals alike seemed to tread lightly when passing him, as if afraid to disturb the calm he carried. Daniel, however, moved as if the world around him had not changed at all. He worked on simple tasks, sanding wood and shaping furniture, never raising his voice, never boasting, never drawing attention to himself. Scifi, on the other hand, could not settle. She had spent the night thinking, replaying every movement, every gesture, and every word Daniel had spoken. Something in him was different, unusual. It was not only that he had stopped her blade with his bare hand, it was the way he had done it, calm, measured, almost effortless. He had not rushed, he had not been angry, and yet his strength had been undeniable. By late morning, Scifi made a decision. She would confront him, not in front of the crowd, not as a spectacle, but alone. She walked through the quiet streets, her steps light but purposeful. The townspeople watched her pass, curious, sensing that something important was about to happen. She reached Daniel's workshop and stood outside for a moment, breathing deeply. Pride and curiosity battled inside her. Part of her did not want to admit she had been wrong. Another part could not resist finding out the truth. Finally, she pushed the wooden door open. Daniel looked up from his workbench. The sunlight fell on his calm face, and for a moment she felt nervous. This was the man she had mocked, the man she had challenged, the man who had shattered her pride as easily as if it had been made of glass. "Daniel," she began, her voice steady, but carrying tension. "I need to know, how did you do it?" Daniel set his tools down gently and wiped his hands on a cloth. He looked at her calmly as though expecting her question. "There is no secret," he said. "There is only what you saw." "That's not enough," she said, frustration rising. "No man can stop a blade like that. You were not even trying. You did not move to block or strike back, and yet, you did it. You are hiding something." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I am not hiding anything. You fought with pride and anger, that is why the blade broke. Strength without control is fragile. You can swing as hard as you like, but if your mind and body are not calm, you will always be limited." Solera's eyes narrowed. "You speak as if you have done this many times before. Who are you? Were you a soldier? A fighter?" Daniel's expression softened. "Long ago I lived in places where strength was needed not for pride but for survival. I learned to move carefully, to control my body, and to act only when necessary. That is all you need to know." Solera studied him, trying to read his face. She had met many warriors in her travels, some powerful, some skilled, but she had never met anyone like him. His strength was not in his arms or his speed, it was in his presence, in his control. He could end a battle without striking, and that was far more dangerous than any sword. "I underestimated you," she admitted quietly, though it was hard for her pride to let the words out loud. "I mocked you. I thought you were just a man, but now I see I was wrong." Daniel nodded, not with arrogance but with understanding. "It is easy to underestimate. Many do. Pride and assumptions blind people to what is real. You were skilled, but you let your own expectations control you. That is the lesson the blade taught." Solera frowned, still unsure. "You say it is a lesson, but why? Why do you teach it to me? You could have left me humbled, embarrassed in front of everyone." "Because humiliating someone does not make them stronger," Daniel replied. "Teaching them control does. You are strong, Solera. But strength without understanding is dangerous, to yourself and to others. I did not break your blade to show my power. I broke it to show the limits of uncontrolled power." For the first time, Solera felt a strange respect for him. He did not boast. He did not demand admiration, and yet he had already proven himself, in a way she could not ignore. Her thoughts turned to the fights she had faced in the past, the victories she had celebrated. She realized that many of those victories had been hollow, won through force but lacking understanding. Daniel had shown her a different kind of power, one that did not need to prove itself through aggression. She looked at the broken blade in her hands again, turning it over slowly. The sharp edges of the wood now seemed less important than the lesson it carried. She felt a weight of humility she had never known, and it unsettled her. She had traveled far and fought many challenges, but none of them had taught her what she had learned in a single moment from this quiet man. "I do not know how to repay you," she said finally. "Or even if I can, I have never met someone like you." Daniel smiled slightly. "There is nothing to repay. What you carry now is understanding. That is more valuable than any reward." Solera nodded slowly. She could not deny the truth in his words. She had thought she was a master of skill and strength, but she now understood that there were limits to pride and arrogance. She had been challenged not by brute force but by control, patience, and calm. That realization was heavier than any physical strike she had ever endured. For the rest of the day she stayed nearby, watching Daniel work in his workshop. She did not interfere, did not speak much, but her eyes followed him as he moved with ease and purpose. She began to see that strength was not always in action. Sometimes it was in restraint. The quiet movements of his hands shaping wood, the careful steps he took, the steady rhythm of his work, all of it spoke louder than words or swords. By evening, Celira finally spoke again. "I want to learn," she said, "not to fight against you, not to prove myself, but to understand what you have." Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "Learning is different from showing skill. It requires patience. Are you willing to be patient?" She nodded firmly. "Yes, I want to be patient." For the first time, the prideful warrior felt a new kind of excitement. She had come seeking to prove herself, but she now sought knowledge. Daniel understood that the lesson was already taking root in her mind. Strength could be taught, but only if the student was willing to listen and observe, not rush and strike. And so, a bond began to form between them, not one of rivalry, but of mutual respect. The woman who had mocked him and the man who had broken, her blades stood together quietly in the fading light, each learning something from the other. The lesson of control, patience, and understanding had begun, and neither of them would forget it. Days passed since the duel, but the story of Daniel and Celira spread far beyond the town square. People still spoke of it, often exaggerating parts of it, but the essence remained the same. A quiet man had broken a warrior's blade with his bare hands. Some said it was magic, others claimed it was impossible, but everyone agreed it was extraordinary. Daniel, however, never sought recognition. He continued his daily work in the workshop, shaping wood with the same calm hands, fixing broken furniture, and helping anyone who came to him for aid. His life remained simple, but the lessons he had taught through action began to ripple quietly through the town. Celira, on the other hand, could not settle into her old habits. She had come to the town to challenge, to prove herself above others, but now her thoughts were consumed with reflection. The broken blade in her possession had become a symbol of humility. She would often hold it in her hands, turning it over and examining it, remembering the moment it snapped. But more than that, she remembered Daniel's calm face, his quiet words, and the way he had moved as if the world were in perfect balance around him. She realized that true strength was not in force, in speed, or in the number of victories one had. It was in control, patience, and understanding. One morning, Celira returned to Daniel's workshop, carrying a small bundle of supplies for him as a gesture of respect. She had thought long and hard about what to say. Pride had once driven her, but now she wanted honesty, guidance, and understanding. Daniel looked up from his workbench where he was carefully carving a chair leg. He saw her standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of humility and determination. "I have come to learn," she said quietly. "I want to understand what you showed me. Not for pride, not for victory, but for strength that matters." Daniel set aside his tools and wiped his hands. "Strength can only be understood when the mind is calm. Are you willing to be patient?" I am," she replied firmly. And so, their lessons began. Each day, Celira observed Daniel's work. She learned that patience and precision mattered more than speed. She saw how he handled each tool carefully, how he measured each cut, how he never rushed even when tired. At first, she struggled. Her movements were too fast, her mind too eager to show skill. But Daniel's calm presence guided her. He would demonstrate once and then let her try. He never criticized harshly. Instead, he explained gently, showing her that mistakes were part of learning, not failures. The townspeople noticed the change in Celira. Where once she had walked with arrogance, challenging everyone, now she moved with humility. She helped people quietly, teaching younger travelers the lessons she learned from Daniel. Though she was still strong and capable, she no longer used her power to mock or intimidate. Her victories were quiet, earned through understanding and care rather than showmanship. Over time, Daniel and Celira grew to respect each other deeply. They were no longer teacher and student in the ordinary sense. They were companions in understanding. Celira had learned that true strength lay not only in the body but in the mind, in the ability to remain calm when others were angry, to act decisively when others panicked, and to choose restraint over pride. Daniel, for his part, appreciated Celira's determination. She had been proud, strong, and impatient, but she had shown the courage to learn, the kind of courage that few possess. One evening, after a long day of work and learning, Celira and Daniel walked through the quiet streets of the town. The festival lights had long gone, leaving only lanterns to cast soft glows on the cobblestones. The town was peaceful, but the memory of that first duel lingered. Celira spoke softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I see now that strength is not what I thought it was," she said. "I used to believe it was about winning, about proving myself above others, but now I understand. It is about control, patience, and knowing when to act. You taught me that without even trying to impress." Daniel smiled gently. The lesson was already there. You only needed to see it. Power, without understanding, is like a blade without balance. It can hurt the one who holds it more than anyone else. Celira nodded, holding the broken piece of her blade in her hand. She had decided not to discard it. It was a reminder of the moment she was humbled, of the man who had taught her more than any teacher, weapon, or battle ever could. As the weeks passed, their story became a quiet legend. Travelers who visited the town often asked to meet Daniel, curious about the man who had broken a warrior's blade. He welcomed them simply, showing his work and sharing wisdom not through boastful tales but through the calm example of his life. Celira accompanied him sometimes, speaking of lessons she had learned, helping others understand that strength was not about pride or showing off, but about self-control, patience, and respect. Even the children of the town began to watch her, fascinated by the change in someone who had once seemed untouchable. Celira would teach them small lessons, how to focus, how to move carefully, how to measure their actions before they acted. She never forgot the lesson Daniel had given her, and through her guidance the lesson reached a new generation. One afternoon, as Daniel shaped a chair leg and Celira helped a young boy learn balance and patience, she looked up and smiled. "I will never forget that day," she said quietly. "When I thought I was above everyone, you showed me that there is more to strength than I could ever imagine." Daniel looked at her and nodded. "And you will carry it with you, in every action, every choice. That is the true lesson of strength." Years later, travelers would still tell the story of the duel in the town square. They would speak of the quiet man who broke the blade of a proud warrior with his bare hands. They would speak of the lesson he taught without words, through patience, calm, and control. But those who truly understood the story knew that it was not about the spectacle or the broken blade. It was about the wisdom that Daniel shared and the change it brought to someone who had once thought she knew everything. Celira continued to grow as a warrior, but now she fought not for pride, not for victory, but for mastery and understanding. She became respected not only for her skill, but for her wisdom, and Daniel remained quietly in the town, shaping wood, helping people, and teaching through example, a man whose true strength could not be measured by any weapon. In the end, the duel had been more than a clash of strength. It had been the beginning of change, a lesson carried quietly through actions, patience, and respect. And though the blade had been broken that day, something far greater had been forged: understanding, humility, and the true meaning of power.